Like how, I mean, it might be too much to ask, but how do you guide people who are experiencing intense grief when meditating? You know, even if they're open to it, it could be quite painful. And I hadn't seen that quite yet in the book. Maybe I'll get to it, but that was just something I wanted to know what you thought about.
Yeah. It's funny. I seem to have like resources for most things except for that I can offer people. Not just my own stuff, but like anyone's stuff. I don't see that much about mindfulness and grief in the world, period. But
Similar, when
so
I was researching, I didn't see much.
yeah, maybe you can write a book about it. Yeah, but um, maybe I'll just kind of share a few brief thoughts, and then you can let me know if you want me to expand on anything or clarify anything. But
And if I pop out of the screen for a second, my apologies. I'm totally listening.
okay, yeah, thank you. Um, would you like me to comment on how to bring mindfulness to grief, or is that kind of your question, or like how to help process grief
Yeah,
with mindfulness?
I would say anything. That's just something
Okay.
that I kept hearing, you know, even like, because grief is not encompasses, of course, to losing a person. It's losing a pet, losing a job, losing a marriage. So that keeps
Yeah.
coming up. So really
Yeah.
anything.
Yeah. Um, so I'm not a grief expert, but I can share a few things. Um, I think it's like to feel grief is generally and typically a good thing. It's a healthy response. So we often need to grieve certain things that are very important to us. Um, Sorry, I don't mean to say that it's a good thing, but that it can be very healthy to grieve. Um,
Yes.
and so with other people, I think it's good to like allow it to, just acknowledge that it's natural. Um,
Mm.
Sometimes uh, it can be helpful to, well, yeah. So in terms of like a mindfulness practice, I think it can be helpful to sense into our like chest cavity, our lungs, and our heart,
Mm-hmm.
because there tends to be sort of a buildup of like liquid element in our chest cavity where there's this like overflow of water element. I don't mean to sound woo woo, but like there's this flood of feeling around there. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think it's helpful just to kind of notice physical sensations around the chest. So, heaviness versus lightness, warmth versus coolness, um, density versus hollowness, movement versus stillness. Like, what does it feel like at a physical, visceral level around the heart and the lungs? Like, what can you feel as you're grieving? What's going on around that area? Not to try to feel a certain thing or not to feel a certain thing, but just notice, like, yeah, as you grieve, what can you feel around the chest or the lungs or the heart? Maybe it's pleasant, maybe it's unpleasant, maybe it's neither. Just noticing. Um, Sometimes people will judge the grief to be bad, or sometimes they'll judge their grief to be right. Um, I think it can be healthy, but I also think that it can be helpful to notice whether we're judging it at all to be good or bad, right or wrong, just to notice, and to see if we can soften either judgment a little bit and be curious about how it actually feels. So a lot of people will grieve for a long time because they feel like it's the right thing to do. It's good that I'm grieving, so I'm going to keep grieving. And so some people will hold on to the grief longer than what would naturally unfold. And sometimes when we hold on to that grief, we might get sick. I know plenty of people who've developed pneumonia because they held on to their grief because they felt like if they let go of the grief or allowed the grief to naturally process, that would mean that they didn't care enough about that person who died. Or it would mean that they're a bad person because they didn't grieve long enough or something. Like there's different reasons why we might hold on to grief longer than how it would naturally unfold. So, earlier I corrected myself by saying, it's not that grief is right, but it can be healthy. So to soften judgments of the grief to being right or wrong, because if we judge the grief to be wrong or bad, then we're resisting feeling it. And so that also does not allow the grief to unfold naturally. So to notice the sensations of grief, notice any judgments of right or wrong, good or bad, soften the judgments, allow yourself to feel what you naturally feel, and allow it to go on its own, or allow it to change naturally. Allow it to intensify or diminish or change. Sometimes grief turns into joy. But allowing it to naturally do its thing and to stay present with it, stay present for it, without trying to push it away or hold on to it. And so sometimes to strengthen our ability to be with grief, it can be helpful to have someone who you trust to be with you as you grieve, so that you feel that connection. Or sometimes it's helpful when you have someone with you to have them behind you with their hand on your shoulder or your upper back, so that they can feel that support, but you're still kind of alone in a sense, but someone's behind you, literally like having your back. Sometimes that can help soften our own approach to our own grief, to allow those emotions to surface. So having someone touch your shoulder behind you can be very helpful as you're kneeling. So like a posture for grieving that's helpful for a lot of people is to kneel on the ground. Sort of sitting on your feet, if that makes sense, with your knees in front of you. And you can start sitting up, but then if grief... What's that? You're doing that now?
I said, yeah, I'm doing that right now. So.
Yeah. And so, and if someone's standing or sitting behind you with their hand on your shoulder, you can like reflect on the loss. And if you need to like hunch over and sob, you can do that in a safe way. So they're still behind you. But that posture tends to work well. And then having a few like shrines around you during the grieving process can also facilitate this feeling of support. So a shrine of ancestors. So you can like have a few mementos or photos or things that remind you of ancestors, either like relatives who have passed, people from like a felt sense of community, whether it's religious, whether it's geographic, whether it's whatever like fosters a sense of sort of like wise elder. So some people will call upon like Native American tribes from that area, or a great grandparent, or even like Jesus or Martin Luther King or Buddha or whoever, but like some physical representation of that ancestor or ancestors on a shrine, like on a table or a couch or whatever, like next to you, to help remind you that it's okay. They're there to support you. There's something greater here, like they're looking out for you, wishing you well, they're bearing witness. You can have a shrine of like things from the earth, like sometimes I'll fill like candle holders with water, like one with water, one with soil, one with a candle, like a lit candle, and then one that's empty to kind of represent air and space. So like the elements, I'll have like the elements around me. With grief, the water element tends to be very strong, but having the elements around me kind of help me to remember a sense of groundedness, a sense of fire, or like temperature, like people relate to fire differently. And then there's also like air and wind, and then there's also space. And for me, that can be helpful just to kind of remember some, you could bring in a tree branch or a flower, and sometimes it can also be helpful to like have something physical or make something physical that represents what it is that you're grieving. So if it's a job loss, I'm going to be kind of humorous here and say like you could get your red stapler, or if you're losing, or if you lost a relative, you could have something that kind of represents your relative, or anything physical that represents what it is that you lost or that you're grieving. Have that, hold on to it as you're grieving, honor it, and then after you've been grieving with it for a while, whether it's an hour or a day or a week or a month, then let it go by, putting in the ocean, setting it on fire, burying it somewhere, and like have a sort of a like inner ceremony where you're literally letting it go, which can be very, very hard.
Yeah. I think this was really helpful because I don't know why. It was just for some reason the concept of grief and meditation, I wasn't sure how to combine them. But it is, as you're saying, almost like the connection to the basics of meditation. And then also like the really helpful ideas that you were just saying that I really like the balancing of the elements, the acknowledgement, even having that supportive person. I just I haven't thought of, doing that for myself or even offering that to other people if I were to teach them. So yeah, that was really helpful.
Can I add one more thing real fast?
Yeah.
After you've been grieving, like immediately following a period of sobbing or intense emotion. Oh, and by the way, it can be helpful to like go somewhere where you can like yell and scream at the top of your lungs. And sometimes there's a ton of anger and grief. Like, how dare you leave? How dare this happen? Like, and I've heard people shout, profanity at the top of their lungs, and they're just, they kind of lose it for a bit out of anger.
Right.
But I think it's healthy to do that. Allow yourself to like get that out and to express it, and like beat your hand on the ground and like scream and stay with it and like sense into what's happening, sense into it, and bring in that gentle, caring curiosity to the body. But to allow yourself to express loudly if you want, including anger, allowing those emotions to surface. But after the intense emotion of it, for you and the person who may be supporting you, if they've been touching your back or they're just as moral support, I do highly advise taking a shower or bath in which you rub yourself in salt. Like rubbing salt all over everywhere as a way to help cleanse that energy off of you.
Okay.
Some people will go so far as to like wash their clothes immediately, change their clothes immediately, vacuum, like kind of clean the space if you can. Because that energy can be so intense that it can stick around and affect all sorts of things. And so I highly recommend, and even like vacuuming with salt, like spraying salt on the ground, and check to see whether you can put salt on certain things. But like clean the space, and so salt can help to do that. Drink tons of water, like lots of water. Make sure, like for women with long hair, do an extra good with the hair because the hair can be sensitive to energy. Like in a good way. If you're there supporting someone else grieving, I would advise you to cover your hair with a hat or a scarf or something, but I would cover the hair as much as you can and remember to breathe. Um, you mentioned trauma sensitive mindfulness, and that book talks about um, layers of suffering, of collective. It's not just personal trauma; it's like collective trauma, and so I think a lot of us could grieve all sorts of things, even if we are not like personally victims of something. We all have something to grieve, I think.